Hey everybody, Greg here, Videomaker, with a head-to-head review of the Panasonic GH4 and the Sony a7S. Now these are two cameras we are really excited to get our hands on. They both sort of have different strengths and weaknesses. In fact, in a lot of ways, they are perfectly opposite cameras. So in the long run, I think that's actually gonna make people's choice between these two cameras pretty easy, because it's really gonna come down to what kind of stuff you're shooting. So let's start by just digging into some of the tech specs that we can all read about, but I just kind of want to point out a few, and then we'll get into some footage. So price-wise, the a7S is around $2,500 body only, and the GH4 is around $1,700. So we're looking at about an $800 difference. So wouldn't necessarily expect them to be evenly matched. Now, we're gonna sort of omit any sort of external things that have to do with these cameras. So we're not gonna test the output of the HDMI on either camera, and we're not gonna really test the interface unit for the GH4. So we're gonna kind of test them out of the box. Just for your knowledge, the lens that we're using on the a7S is the Zeiss 24-70 f4 E-mount full frame. And on the Panasonic, it's the Lumix 12-35 f2.8, which, because of a crop factor, is a 24-70 equivalent. So it's a pretty evenly matched, and both those lenses are near and around $1,000. So the lenses should provide us a reasonable, matched output there. Now, both of these cameras have a lot of different formats that you can use. So from MP4 to AVC HD and all sorts of different things. Now on the Sony, it's got an XAVC-S format that we weren't able to test because of the memory card that we didn't have. So basically we use AVC HD, and that's the 24p version of that. Now the Panasonic, we tested a couple different things. We did test some of the UHD 4K, and then we also used the All-I 24p. Both of those are MOV. So those are what we use for the test, but there are a lot of options. So, but those are pretty much evenly matched. So no matter what kind of footage you prefer to shoot, you could probably shoot those on either one of these cameras. So, but that's what we're using for our test. So sensor-wise, pretty big difference here. So we've got the full frame sensor on the a7S and a micro four thirds on the Panasonic. Now, this can either be, as far as lens selection, an advantage or a disadvantage. So the full frame for the a7S is gonna be easier to get shallow depth of field. And then for wider angle lenses, they're gonna be true wide angle lenses. So if you buy a 14mm lens, it's really gonna be a 14mm lens. Whereas the micro four thirds in HD, it's got a 2x crop factor. So that 14mm lens just became effectively a 28mm lens, et cetera, et cetera. And now on the long end of things, you could, think about it that way. So, 105mm lens would be more like a 210. But you could also use an APS-C crop mode on the a7S to sort of get that advantage as well. But it's just something to think about. But the micro four thirds definitely gonna be a little bit tougher to get that nice shallow depth of field. The other thing is, because of the way these sensors are designed, just by the nature of the a7S being bigger, it's gonna be better in low light. Now this particular sensor happens to be extremely good in low light, and we'll talk about that. The micro four thirds, not so much good in low light. Definitely, if I were to compare these two, the noise level on this is, I would call it fairly average, especially for micro four thirds, whereas I would call the Sony a7S extremely impressive. So if you do a lot of low light shooting, that is a key factor of the a7S. Let's take a look at a couple examples of low light shooting and see what you think of the results. So that was just basically a sampling of both cameras shooting with roughly the same settings in very low light. So in the one case, there's literally just a glow stick, and in the other one, it was just the Christmas tree that was lighting the shot. So if you were to look closely, there is definitely a significant amount of increased noise on the Panasonic. Now, the other thing is the limit of the ISO, which is 6400 on the Panasonic. Well, the Sony's ridiculous limit is somewhere in the 400,000 range. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that that's completely usable. Yes, it's neat, but usable, that's another factor. But I shot some footage well up into the 40,000 range that I think is completely usable, and I didn't apply any noise reduction to any of this. So let's take a look at this, basically this shot that we shot with both cameras, and then I took the A7S and I started pushing that ISO higher. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so clearly the low light winner is the A7S, and I don't think anybody would refute that. It's just designed that way, and I mean, it's impressive in low light even compared to other full frame cameras. So definitely tip my hat to that for that comparison. Now, when it comes to 4K, however, this is where I think the Panasonic definitely has the edge, and the reason being is it's in camera. You don't have to buy anything extra or run anything out of the camera to shoot either DCI 4K, so if you're gonna shoot something that's gonna definitely go in the cinema, that's great because it's got that aspect ratio, or if you're shooting something for UHD or 4K TV, then it's also right in camera. Now, the bit rate on this is 100 megabits per second, which is actually not necessarily that high for 4K, but it gets the job done and it's easy to edit on your system. And really, the 4K results look really nice. So the detail on the 4K image, even compared to Panasonic's HD footage, is really nice. So let's take a look at a couple detail shots from both cameras, and you can make sort of a judgment for yourself. Now, I'm not saying the A7S doesn't have extremely nice detail, because it does, but it's not 4K, so you're not gonna shoot an interview and then cut into that shot unless you're using some type of external recorder, and that's a whole nother purchase and a whole nother ball of wax. So let's take a look at those shots. So, you know, in my opinion, detail-wise, both these cameras really are really nice images, and the advantage of shooting 4K and being able to punch into an interview shot or something like that is definitely an edge to the Panasonic when we're talking about just in-camera functionality, and it's great. So now let's talk about dynamic range. So both of these cameras have picture styles that you can manipulate, but the Sony is definitely, I think, more designed for somebody who wants to shoot a flatter image and really work at it in post. So that dynamic range, I mean, they claim up to 14 stops, but I do think it definitely has the edge over the Panasonic. So an important note here is that in order to get that 14 stops of dynamic range, you really are going to have to use some picture profiles that essentially will give you a minimum ISO of 3200. Now what this means is it's going to be very difficult to shoot unless you have some ND filters along with you, or you can shoot at f/22 outdoors. But other than that, it does give you that wide dynamic range. Now, I'm not saying the Panasonic doesn't have a really good dynamic range. They both shoot nice images, but let's take a look at some examples here. And now, so for these shots, I shot in various different picture styles or picture profiles, and I basically tried to get them to where the sky wasn't being clipped at all. So I didn't do much color correction to these. So in some of these picture profiles, you'll see the shadows are really dark. And then in some of the other ones, you'll see that they're really lifted. So there's a lot of latitude there for post. And on the A7S images, I think you'll see that they definitely stand up to grading better than the Panasonic version. So let's take a look at those. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about recording time. So it's a little interesting in that the A7S, originally when we talked to Sony at NAB, they said there wouldn't be a recording limit on it, but obviously either technical limitations or tax limitations changed that. So there is a 2950 recording limit on the A7S, and that's regardless of where you buy it. Now the Panasonic also has a little bit of an interesting quirk in that if you buy it in the US version does not have a record limit. However, if you buy it in Europe, it does have a record limit, and there's a long story about taxes and things like that and what's considered a camcorder and things like that. But the bottom line is, in the US, Panasonic, no record limit, so that's great. In Europe, it's a wash. Also, the Panasonic can switch between NTSC, PAL, or Cinema, which is 24, true 24p. So that's actually a big deal, especially if you're shooting stuff that's definitely going into cinema. It's not that you can't shoot on the A7S and eventually get it to a movie format, but you're stuck with either NTSC if you buy it in the US, or PAL in some areas. Now, some areas claim that there is a PAL or NTSC version for the A7S that you can switch between, but at least in the US and Europe, it's either or, but the Panasonic can switch between all of them. So it's really a true, what they would say, world camera, which is great. Another feature that they both do have is they both have 60p at 1920 by 1080, which is fine. But the Panasonic actually has a variable frame rate mode. Now, this is at 1920 by 1080, and how it works is you basically select 24p, let's say, but it says, hey, you can use variable frame rate, and then you can select numerous steps between 2 frames per second and 96. And that 96 is at full 1920 by 1080, and that plays back at 25% speed, and it looks really nice. And you can take a look at this footage right here. So on the flip side of that, the 2-frame version, now really below 24, there's just 2 and 12. So, 12 would play at double speed and 2 would play at a faster speed. But the neat thing that I didn't mention before is it actually records 24 frames in a second. So when you bring this footage into your timeline, it's already sped up or slowed down as a movie. So you don't have to worry about anything like that. So the 2 gives you a nice kind of like time lapse built in. And the 96 gives you a very nice slow motion effect without having to interpret footage or anything like that. Now the Sony does do 120 frames per second, but it is at 1280 by 720, so it's at that reduced resolution. So, it depends on what kind of stuff you shoot. You can use the Play Memories app to use, the photo mode, or you could use a controller to do true time lapse in either one, but the video features are pretty nice on the Panasonic. So they both have zebras, they both have focus peaking, so that's kind of a wash, and they both work really well. Didn't test the audio in this case because I'm really just more focused on the video aspect of it. So now one issue that they also both have is rolling shutter. So the A7S by all accounts has a very undesirable rolling shutter, and the Panasonic has an undesirable rolling shutter. So let's take a look at a couple examples of those. Other things to think about: battery life. The Sony definitely does not have as long of a battery life as the Panasonic. I would say the Panasonic is significantly longer. Also, the flip out screens on the back, the Panasonic has a very flexible, flips all the way 180 degrees, tilts up, tilts down, all that stuff. The Sony screen does pull outward and tilt down and up, just not to the same degree as the Panasonic, especially on the down tilt. So, a really high angle shot might be a little bit more difficult to see it. Also, the Panasonic is a touchscreen monitor, which I find really nice. There were times where I was first using it going, oh, well, how do I get to that return? I'm like, oh, I just touch it on the screen. So that's definitely a nice advantage. What it really comes down to is what kind of stuff are you going to be shooting? So while it might be more difficult to get shallow depth of field on the Panasonic, well, that might not be a bad thing for you if your goal is not to get a lot of shallow depth of field. So if you're shooting a lot of events or stuff like that. But of course, if you're going to be shooting in uncontrolled lighting situations and low light situations, the A7S is going to be the camera that you want to choose. That being said, if internal 4K is important to you, then the Panasonic's a better choice. So, if you have control over your lighting, you can overcome a lot of the noise issues of the Panasonic, and you're gonna get that 4K in camera. It's really easy, there's no fussing about it. But if you're not having control over that, then, the Sony might be a great behind the scenes camera, or weddings, even though it's got the record time limit. Weddings, I could see it being really useful for. It really depends on what you're shooting. They're both great cameras. They're both a pleasure to use. So it just comes down to what's more important to you. So I'm Greg with Videomaker. Hope this has been helpful. We'll see you next time.